Hey everybody, thank you for joining me for another tier list. Today we are going to be talking about an amazing English band called Kitchens of Distinction. They are a group that I consider to be criminally underrated, and I haven't seen very much dialogue on the internet regarding their discography and how different people rank their albums, so I figured this would be a perfect group to cover for my next tier list. I only discovered them about 2 years ago, but as soon as I heard them, I was immediately intrigued by their sound, and to me they felt like this little hidden gem of a band that I had stumbled upon. So I'm very excited to be covering them for this video. And for anyone listening who hasn't checked this band out, I would highly recommend doing so. I think they offer a lot of different things stylistically for different types of music listeners, between their shoegaze elements as well as the dream pop and alternative rock flavors, depending on which albums and which songs you listen to. So what I'm going to do today is go through their 5 studio albums, starting with Love Is Hell and going all the way up to Folly. And I will score each of them on this tier list, with S being the highest and D being the lowest, and I'll talk a little bit about each album, let you know my thoughts, and we will see where we end up. And please feel free to let me know your thoughts in the comments. I would love to hear where you agree and disagree and how you would rank these 5 studio albums, so please let me know. Okay, I think that's about it. Let's jump right into it. Alright, starting out, we have their debut studio album from 1989 titled Love Is Hell, and I will give this one an A. Really solid first release. It's not my number one favorite from their discography, but it is certainly a great first album to put out there and a great introduction to their very unique sound. Like I said in the introduction, oftentimes Kitchens of Distinction does get labeled as a shoegaze band, and while their music does contain shoegaze elements to it, there is definitely more to their sound than just shoegaze, and I think the nuances of their style is apparent right from this first album. Instrumentally and production-wise, there is definitely a shoegazy, dream pop sort of sound going on, with these really washy, reverb-laden guitars and guitar parts that can oftentimes be masked and obscured somewhere in the background. The way the drums are mixed certainly contain those shoegaze and dream pop sorts of production as well. Vocally, though, Patrick Fitzgerald's voice is much more front and center and decipherable, which would be an element that is different from the traditional shoegaze sound, where the vocals are usually masked behind the guitars and are more focused on the pitches rather than the actual lyrics. And another thing that is unique to this group is the fact that their lead singer is gay, and he was being very open and forthright about it in his lyrics right from this first album, and that was very uncommon for a musician to do in the late 80s and early 90s, and if they did do it, it would be in a much more disguised manner, but Patrick just put it all out there, and the fact that he did it in such a direct and unafraid manner is really commendable, and just another additional layer as to why I find this band so fascinating and so awesome. On this album, we have 9 tracks, opening up with In a Cave, which brings things in on sort of a mid-tempo, dancey love song with some dream pop elements to it. Not a bad song, but for me personally, I don't find this to be the strongest and most engaging opening track, especially in comparison to the openers of their future albums. It is one of my least favorite songs on here, and it is one of the reasons why I put this in A tier as opposed to S. But after that, I love the turn it takes with track 2 titled Time to Groan. This is a really pretty and dreamy track with some great vocal melodies and these swelly, obscured guitar layers in the background with a really cool bass line in the forefront. And my absolute favorite part of this track is when the chorus enters. It just feels so euphoric. It has this beautiful vocal melody, and the way the guitars are layered and the harmonies underneath it creates just this beautiful combination of sounds. And in this song, as we will see in some of their other songs as well, he is writing about a woman who is dealing with something involving another man, and throughout a lot of their discography, there will be this blend of love songs that are about other men, but also love songs from a woman's perspective, and I've always found that contrast lyrically throughout their music very interesting. After that, we go into track 3 titled Shiver, which brings the energy down a bit into some more chill, laid-back territory. I think this is a cool song, but for me it's one of those tracks where I'm not super intrigued by the opening section, but when the chorus enters, I really love it. So that's not a favorite one on here for me, but I wouldn't say it's a bad track either. The chorus definitely redeems it for me. But then after that, we have my favorite song on here by far, with track 4 titled Prize. Absolutely incredible song, and this was the first single for the album, released in 1988. And again, a song that is very direct about it being a love song about another man, and in my opinion, it has some of the most beautiful vocal melodies of any song on this album. The guitar sounds are so pretty and lush, adding a whole additional layer to the beautiful richness and dreaminess of this track. And then when that final section enters, it just hits so hard and feels so satisfying. An absolutely incredible song that I cannot say enough good things about. And then that is followed by the other single from this album, The Third Time We Opened the Capsule. A great song with a really nice drive to it, catchy vocal parts, and great guitar layerings over the instrumental sections. One of the guitars on that section almost has a keyboard sort of sound to me, so additionally they are getting some really amazing guitar tones on this as well. Then we have Her Last Day in Bed, another favorite of mine on here. I really love the drum part. The bass part being at the forefront of the groove and playing multiple notes at the same time while the guitar fills in sparsely around that creates a very cool effect. The addition of the violin also adds such a nice touch, especially over the heavy sections. Then we bring the energy up very nicely with Courage Mother, a song with a nice drive to it, but a sad song lyrically, talking about a male and female couple wanting to split up and all of the fears and ramifications that come with that. And then that is followed by Mainly Mornings, which is definitely my least favorite song on here. Musically, I find it kind of boring, and it's always been the one big skip over track on here for me, and another reason as to why I put it in A tier. But then the album concludes with a great 6-minute track titled Hammer. This one is a little more mellow in that dream pop sort of realm with these beautiful guitar layers and tasteful vocal melodies, and I particularly love when the instruments pick up in intensity for the final 3 minutes of the song, concluding the album in a very intense and satisfying way. So a great closing track, and in general, I have very positive feelings about this album. My only two gripes are the opening track In a Cave and Mainly Mornings, but other than that, I think they delivered a really solid batch of songs that does a great job of introducing everybody to their sound, and there are a couple of songs on here that would definitely make my list of favorite Kitchens of Distinction songs, with tracks like Prize, Time to Groan, and Her Last Day in Bed. On the 1993 edition with the 4 bonus tracks, they also included the amazing song Elephantine, which has always been a favorite of theirs for me, and I really wish they had included that on the original release because I think that would have really kicked this album up to the next level. But irregardless of that, it's still a very good debut album. So this one gets an A. Okay, next we have their second studio album from 1991 titled Strange Free World, and this one gets an easy S. Absolutely incredible album, and this was the first album that I had heard by Kitchens of Distinction because this one usually makes a lot of lists of top shoegaze albums on the internet, which is how I found out about it, and for me this would definitely be a contender for my top 10 favorite shoegaze albums. I love what they did on this record, and I do consider it to be a really solid step up from Love Is Hell. It's got amazing production from Hugh Jones, who had worked with the likes of Echo and the Bunnymen and Pale Saints. The production has a similar style to the first release, but I think it's improved and sounds more refined on this one, with everything just sounding more crisp. It opens up with Railwade, which is, in my opinion, about as good of an opener as they could possibly have put out. It starts out with this nice drum groove and a driving bass line with strummed guitar chords that are sort of obscured in the background and are followed by these upfront single-note guitar parts, and then the beautiful vocal melody enters and the song takes off and eventually builds into this huge chorus that is so satisfying when it finally enters. I love the layering of the guitars. The background parts complement the vocals so nicely, and lyrically it's very powerful. Patrick really writes some incredible stuff that can be open to so many different interpretations and really makes you ponder upon what he is writing about, which is another element that I think separates him and this group from so many other bands of their time. And just in general, I think this is as good of a song as they could have opened with, and after hearing this track, I was immediately intrigued and needed to explore the rest of their work. After that, the album continues with Quick as Rainbows, which was a re-recording of an earlier single that they had released. The music and mood on this one is a little more upbeat and hopeful sounding compared to the opening track, but the lyrics are pretty sad and are talking about a woman who seems to be alone and has lost hope and meaning in her life. A really great follow-up track to the opener and a great contrast. And then we have Hypnagogic, which changes the mood very nicely again. This one has a nice driving bass and drum groove in 6/8 Time. The vocals are really nice, and another song that has such a hard-hitting and satisfying chorus when it comes in. And because of the obscured guitar parts in the background, sometimes there are chords that sound a little dissonant, but they're hard to kind of pick out unless you really listen closely. And there is definitely one of those chords over the section where he says, "I have slept 10,000 nights," which I believe is the chorus. Really interesting chordal part over that section. I would recommend checking that out and just listen really closely with headphones, and you'll notice what I'm talking about if you haven't heard it already. Then we go into "He Holds Her, He Needs Her," a pretty track, and another one to me that really just goes to the next level when the chorus enters. It just feels so good. So many great choruses all throughout this album. Then that is followed by a song called "Polaroids," and this is one that I have conflicting feelings about. Lyrically, I really like what he's talking about, and the whole idea of going through memories through looking at pictures, is something that we can all relate to. But musically, I've never found this song very exciting, and it is definitely my least favorite track on here. The only skip over track for me. I know some people are going to disagree with that, but just being honest, that's the one song on here that I've never been crazy about. But the thing that I do like about this song is the dissonant intervals that are happening between the bass and guitar parts. It's really subtle, but if you listen close, you'll notice from time to time there's a little tense note combination that is happening, and you could hear it really clearly at 1 minute and 7 seconds in when he says, "What did you do?" And for me personally, that little element to this song makes it twice as enjoyable for me, because that little part is so eerie and just adds this little tense feeling of darkness just sparsely throughout the song. If you read the lyrics throughout the song too, it's pretty dark too, so the dissonance is definitely appropriate and fitting. But other than that, I do think this is the weakest song on the album, but I wouldn't say it's a bad song. After that, we have a beautiful driving love song called "Gorgeous Love." This one is in that upbeat dream pop sort of realm with awesome arpeggiated guitar backgrounds, a really nice lift in energy after "Polaroids." And then it goes into "A Spray," a beautiful track with some really dreamy elements to it, really interesting chord progressions in the guitars, particularly over the section where he says, "I wanted to shed my skin." The third chord is very colorful and interesting and unexpected, in my opinion. Then that is followed by "Drive That Fast," which was the other single from this album and is probably their most popular song. A great track with a nice drive to it, really dreamy sounding guitars with nice single note lines and arpeggiated parts, and I think this is a great song to appeal to somewhat of a mainstream sort of music listener, and I think that's why this song became as popular as it did. And as much as people love this song, I like it a lot too, but it's never been one of my favorite songs of theirs. Not saying it's a bad song either, but there's definitely a handful of other songs on this album that I do like better, but nevertheless, it's obviously still a great song of theirs. And then after that, we have the second to last track titled "Within the Days of Passion." I absolutely love this song, and I consider it to be the unsung hero of this album. It's got everything that I want: tasty drum and bass grooves, really awesome vocal melodies, nice textural guitar parts, and a really beautiful hard-hitting chorus. To me, it's the perfect song with a sadder sort of mood to set up the final track of the album, which is "Under the Sky, Inside the Sea," a really incredible closing track that takes its time and builds very nicely. We have the addition of a trumpet as well, which adds some really nice richness to the sound. The dynamics build into the final section where everything just hits at once, with the trumpets doing the main melody and the other instruments picking up in intensity until everything just drops down and concludes the album in the most satisfying way possible. So I think this is an incredible album with so many great tracks. A couple of favorites of mine are "Railway," "Hypnagogic," "A Spray," and "Within the Days of Passion." And like I said, "Polaroids" is the only track that takes away from this album a little bit for me, but it's still lyrically very strong, and it does have some interesting things going on musically, and it's surrounded by so many incredible songs that it definitely doesn't take away from the album very much, and certainly wouldn't bump it down to A tier for me. So incredible album. This one gets an easy S. Okay, next we have their third studio album from 1992 titled "The Death of Cool," and this one will also get an S. Another incredible album, and in all honesty, I've always had a hard time choosing which one I like more between this and "Strange Free World." I think ultimately it just comes down to what mood I'm in when I'm listening to it. This one is similar stylistically to the previous release and continues to build off of what they had established, but I do think that Patrick's subject matter and lyrical writings reach new levels on this album, particularly with the tracks that talk about the plight of living in the early 90s as a gay man and all of the different struggles that they face. We have 10 tracks, and it opens up very tastefully with What Happens Now. It brings things in with a great energy and a similar drive to Railwade from the previous release, but I would say that the mood on this one is a little more on the dream poppy side, whereas Railwade was a little bit darker. The chorus is so pretty on this one too. I really love where the chords go. It enters into some really colorful harmonic territories. After that, we keep a similar vibe going with track 2 titled Four Men. Another very pretty and dreamy track with a really catchy, faster vocal melody and really nice guitar backgrounds. And once again, a very nice contrast between the verse and the chorus with the mood and the dynamics. The chorus really brings up the energy and intensity with the distorted guitars and a very colorful starting note in the bass guitar as well, creating a pretty slash chord where they're playing a major chord, but the bass starts out with the third interval on the bottom rather than the root note. And that creates a really beautiful effect. And another one that is, again, very forthright about homosexuality. And then after that, they bring the energy down a bit with a song called On Tooting Broadway Station. This is a sadder love song about another man with a very vengeful sort of message in the lyrics. On this one, I particularly love the way the two guitars and bass overlap on each other during the clean verses. Some really great harmonizing between the three parts, creating some beautiful textures. And then we go into a track in 6/8 time titled Breathing Fear, which was one of the singles for this album. And this one is a very powerful and emotional commentary on homophobia and what it was like having to live with the intolerance of that time period. And the subject matter is about a boy who has been beaten up by homophobes, and he has a black eye from it. Just a very dark song, and lyrically one of Patrick's strongest writings, in my opinion. Then we get to the halfway point of the album with the longest track, the 8-minute long Gone World Gone. A really pretty song that builds and layers very nicely, starting out with a bass groove serving as the foundation of the song, and that gets layered with electric guitar textures as well as some acoustic arpeggios. The drums have these subtle changes in the groove from time to time that add some additional layers of depth to the track as well, and I really like the vibe of this song. It's a nice longer track that really takes its time and builds nicely, and it's a great choice for the halfway point of the album. Another one with a very satisfying chorus as well when it finally enters. Great intensity and a great contrast from the more subdued bass-heavy verses. Then we have the other single from this album titled When in Heaven, a track that's more on the poppier side, but dealing with very intense and emotional subject matter about death and mortality, centered around the AIDS epidemic, which was at a high point in 1992 when this album was released. And I think by now it's clear that Patrick's writing has reached new levels lyrically, and I think in terms of doing commentary on gay life in the early 90s, this album is certainly a very key and important contribution to that discussion. Then we continue with another track on the longer side with the 7-minute and 20-second Mad as Snow. Another one with really beautiful guitar arpeggios harmonized very nicely against the bass. Incredible use of dynamics throughout and just beautiful sad lyrics seeming to be about someone who is in an unfulfilling romantic relationship and the person singing is attempting to comfort them. Beautiful metaphor about snow and emotions too, and saying that as it snows you can't get hurt because snow fades, which I would assume is being related to bad things that are happening and how over time everything will fade away just like snow does. Definitely one of my favorite tracks on here. Then we continue with a really beautiful high-energy track titled Smiling. I absolutely love the guitar parts on this one. It's got the perfect amount of delay and reverb, and it uses really pretty chord movements and arpeggiated parts, and I think this song provides a nice little jolt of energy to set up the last two tracks of the album. Another song with a very satisfying and hard-hitting chorus as well, as I've already said so many times. But then we change gears and we go into a track called Blue Petal, a longer track as well, being a little over 7 minutes. And as you can see, there are a couple of songs on this album that do, go more into the longer side as opposed to the previous release. And this one opens up on a relatively chill and low-key groove with the bass being the foundation and the guitars doing some atmospheric background sounds. We also hear some harmonica as well, which adds a very interesting touch. I love the way that this song builds. Once they start bringing up the dynamics at the halfway point, the sound just keeps getting bigger and bigger and bigger until we finally reach that climax. Super intense and awesome track that sets up the final song very nicely with track 10, which is titled Can't Trust the Waves. This one is a nice, dreamy track and is the one song to feature the guitarist Julian Swales on lead vocals. The song has really beautiful vocal work and a great chord movement, particularly in the second section, which has a diminished chord in one spot spot that creates this really beautiful tension that I just love so much and really catches my ear. I also love the addition of the saxophone on this one. I think it adds a really nice touch. So as you can see, I really have nothing bad to say about this album. There's no skip over tracks for me. I think they did a great job of putting out a great follow-up to Strange Free World that still contains all of those great elements that we heard on that release, but also builds upon it and delivers some very fresh and high quality tracks with some new subject matter also being introduced lyrically. I've always been surprised that this album doesn't pop up as much as Strange Free World does in top shoegaze album lists. I've seen it on a few, but Strange Free World definitely seems to be like kind of the poster child for this band. But I think that this album is right up there with it and is just as good and an absolutely amazing follow-up. So this one gets an easy yes. Okay, next we have their fourth studio album from 1994 titled Cowboys and Aliens, and I'll give this one a B. In my opinion, this is their weakest release up to this point, but I also definitely do not think it's a bad album by any stretch. There is a large chunk of this that I do really enjoy, but in comparison to their first three releases, I do think there was a bit of a dip in quality with some of the songs on here, but to be fair, the first three albums were so strong and are certainly tough acts to follow, especially now that we've reached the mid-90s, and anytime I'm listening to a band that had come out of the late 80s and early 90s shoegaze scene, I'm always curious as to how their albums from the mid-90s will sound, because in the mid-90s, shoegaze had started to fade out, and a lot of the bands that had came from that scene tended to change their styles after their first few albums, and we see that with a lot of bands like Ride, Catherine Wheel, and Lilies. But once I put on the opening track, Sand on Fire, I was very fortunate to hear that it still very much sounds like the Kitchens of Distinction that we know. Of course, there are still some subtle differences here and there, but they definitely didn't do a complete 180 in their sound and style, and I was just pleasantly surprised to hear that, because with some of those other bands that I mentioned, you can listen to their early 90s albums and then go to something from the mid to late 90s, and it almost sounds like two completely different bands. But to me, this still sounds very much like them. It opens up with Sand on Fire, which I think is a pretty solid opener. I like the way it brings things in. The guitars sound really cool. It's always sort of reminded me of the way My Bloody Valentine's Loveless opens up with Only Shallow. I definitely think Only Shallow is a way better song, so don't get the wrong impression by me saying that, but the way the guitars enter on this one has always reminded me a little bit of that. And while I do think Sand on Fire is a pretty good song to open with, I wouldn't say it's as strong of an opener as their previous two albums. And ultimately, one of the main reasons why I put this in B tier isn't necessarily because I dislike a lot of the tracks on here. It's more so just from comparing it to their other three albums and how much I enjoy the songs on there in comparison to the songs on here. After Sand on Fire, we have track 2 titled Get Over Yourself, a song that I think is okay. I wouldn't say it's great, but it does have some arpeggiated guitar parts and interesting chord movements that I think are nice, but it's definitely not a standout track on here for me. And so far, I don't think the opening two tracks are as strong as the opening two of any of the other three albums. But then we go to track 3, which is one of my favorites on here, titled Thought He Had Everything. It's a very cool song with a really interesting chord voicing in the progression of the opening section in the guitars. That second chord is just so dissonant and eerie and really catches my ear, and is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting chord movements of any Kitchens of Distinction song, which was a very pleasant surprise to hear. And one of the things that I do like about this album, from a musical perspective, I think we definitely do have a couple of little surprising things like that that are sprinkled throughout this album, which makes it much more enjoyable for me. After that, we have the title track, Cowboys and Aliens. I like this song a lot. I love the way it starts out with the full band and then drops down to just acoustic guitar for the vocal parts. Very cool contrast, and I think it creates this really nice, dark, and suspenseful sort of mood when the vocals come in. I also like the bar of 7 that they throw in over the instrumental section as well. I feel like they don't do odd time signatures very often, so I thought that was a very cool little touch to add. And once again, just a nice little surprise that's thrown in one of these tracks. After that, we have Come On Now, another song that has a lot of interesting little subtle things going on. The arpeggiated guitar parts are very pretty. The snare sound is incredibly unique for the opening section, very high-pitched and punchy, and just really different sounding, almost distracting with just how intense that snare is. The distorted guitar parts, again, have some interesting chord movements that I really enjoy. Lyrically, it's a really deep and sad song commenting on living a life of homosexuality in a world that is not very accepting of it, and how he finds his solace from it through the love of his partner. And then that is followed by my favorite song on here titled Remember Me. I know this isn't a popular song of theirs, but something about this track just hits me differently. I just find it so beautiful. I love the vocal melodies, the progressions in the guitar, the contrast between the first and second section. It all just creates such a dreamy and pretty atmosphere. The opening section is also in 3-bar phrases, which, like I said, another one of those little interesting musical surprises that is thrown in there. And then we continue with One of Those Sometimes Is Now, which changes up the vibe, opening with acoustic guitar and vocals. I know this is one of the more popular songs on here, but this is a track that I've never found particularly exciting for whatever reason. I really enjoy the last 2 minutes of the song when the band enters. I think there are some really beautiful sounds and textures going on throughout that, but the opening 3.5 minutes have never done much for me for whatever reason. The final 2 minutes of the song are very solid, though. I'm not particularly crazy about the next track either, Here Comes the Swans, and in general, I will say that after track 6, all of my favorite songs from this album have already happened, and the momentum does die down a bit for me, and is another reason why I put this in B tier. We continue with Now It's Time to Say Goodbye, which was the single from this album, and this is the one song from the second half of the album that I do enjoy and is the saving grace. I particularly love the chorus. The vocal harmonies between Patrick and Katie Meehan are so beautiful, and the additional vocal work of Katie Meehan on this album I think also do add a really beautiful touch and complement Patrick's vocals very nicely. Then that is followed by easily my least favorite song on here, titled Pierced. This song has just never done anything for me. I've always found it to be pretty boring, and it would definitely be a contender for one of my least favorite Kitchens of Distinction songs. And then after that, we have the final track titled Prince of Mars, which I think is a pretty good closer. Again, if I'm comparing it to the other 3 albums, I would say it is their worst closing track yet, but I also don't think it's a bad song, and I think the instrumental section for the last couple of minutes builds up really beautifully and brings the album to such a satisfying climax to conclude it on. So in general, this album has like 5 or 6 tracks that I really enjoy, and then a couple that I think are okay, and then a couple that I'm not crazy about. But like I said, I do appreciate the fact that they are still keeping the general essence of their sound at this point in their discography. And although this is my least favorite of their 4 releases up to this point, it still has a couple of tracks that I think are amazing, like Thought He Had Everything, Remember Me, and Now It's Time to Say Goodbye. So not my favorite release of theirs, but definitely not a bad album either, so this will get a B. Alright, so following the release and the underwhelming response to Cowboys and Aliens, the group would get dropped from their record label, and after that they had signed to a new indie label called Fierce Panda Records, and they would release one single for them, but they would ultimately decide to end the group in 1996. Each member would go on to do a variety of different musical projects, and eventually the band would decide to reunite and begin writing new material in 2011, and it would eventually culminate into their 5th and most recent studio album from 2013 titled Folly, and I will give this one an A. I really enjoy this album, and I think it was a very pleasant surprise for everybody. The album features 11 tracks, 10 of them being new, and the 11th track is a repeated song from the album but with different lyrics, and I think they did a great job of giving us a batch of awesome tracks with a great blend of some songs that sound more similar to old Kitchens of Distinction, but also some tracks that go into some very interesting new directions that we hadn't heard them explore before, and they are also definitely adding a bit more to their instrumentation throughout this with the addition of instruments like piano, sleigh bells, synthesizers, strings, and trumpet. The music is still very much guitar-centric though, and most of these new instruments are used more for providing additional textures or are used for just specific sections here and there throughout songs. It opens up with Oak Tree, which starts the album off on a much different sound from the old Kitchens of Distinction, with this one opening up with acoustic guitar and piano, an instrumentation that we had never seen them utilize before, and I think this is an awesome opener and still contains those beautiful vocal melodies and amazing guitar layers that we love from their old sound, but also going into some new interesting territories that we hadn't heard yet, and I love the way it feels when the full band enters. Such a huge sound and much different production as well from their earlier works, which obviously is to be expected when you have almost a 20-year gap from your previous album. There's going to be a lot of changes in the technology and the equipment that you're using. And, that's apparent right from this opening track. Then we go into Extravagance, a nice follow-up track with great vocal work, nice contrasting acoustic and electric guitar parts, and I particularly love the use of the sleigh bells in the chorus. It adds a really interesting touch, and we will hear that instrument a few more times throughout this album. Then we have Disappeared, which is my favorite of the opening 3 tracks. I particularly love the recurring single-note guitar line, such pretty interval jumps, and very catchy. I also love the darkness of the chord progression with some really eerie movements going on. And again, another song with a great use of the sleigh bells. Then we go into Photographing Rain, which opens up with a dark and ominous sounding piano part, which eventually gets layered with electric and nylon string guitars. I really love the intensity of the final chorus on this one too. It feels so nice. Then we continue with one of my favorite songs on here, Japan to Jupiter. I really love the chord progression. It almost has a Britpop sort of sound to it, but then every once in a while they land on these really unexpected and dissonant chords that really catch my ear. I would say this is probably the poppiest track on this album thus far, but those interesting chord movements add a layer of eeriness to the track that I just love so much. Then we go into some new territory with Wolves/Crows. This one has a really awesome intensity to it. The lower vocal harmonies add some really nice darkness, and the chord progression goes in all sorts of eerie directions. Between the vocal melodies, the chord progression, and the synth parts, this song has always given me like a Muse sort of vibe to it, but much better than Muse in my opinion. I've never been a huge fan of Muse. And then after that, we have No Longer Elastic, which is in a similar eerie vein to the previous track. This one starts more subdued and builds much more, but still contains those dark chord movements and also has some string and brass parts as well. And this one has always given me like a musical sort of vibe to it. So up to this point in the album, I would say the majority of the tracks do sound different from their other 4 albums. But like I said, they still contain those elements that I love from Kitchens of Distinction, but also sound very refined and fit very well for the time that this album was written and recorded. I would say that once we get to the final couple of tracks, we do get a little bit more resemblance to their older sound, particularly with track 8 titled I Wish It Would Snow. Such a beautiful and dreamy song, and once again, a great use of sleigh bells, and in the context of this song, that instrument definitely adds to that snowy imagery that the song elicits. Then we go into Tiny Moments, Tiny Omens, another one that has some more resemblance to the old Kitchens of Distinction sound. This one is so beautiful. I love the mood, the vocal harmonies, the string backgrounds, and the chorus hits so hard and feels so good. Definitely one of my favorites on here. Then we have track 10, which is technically the last new song of the album, with track 11 being another version of Extravagance with different lyrics. Track 10 is titled The Most Beautiful Day, which is such a pretty track to wrap up the album on. I particularly love the contrast between the first 2 sections, with the opening section being very peaceful and dreamy, and then section 2 gets much darker and menacing sounding. A perfectly placed final track for the album, and in my opinion, the 2 strongest sequences of songs throughout this album are tracks 8 to 10 and tracks 3 to 6. Both just give us 3 incredible sets of tracks back to back, but I do think the final 3 tracks are the strongest point of this album. And while I don't dislike any of the songs on here, I would say that a couple of them are the kinds of songs that I do need to be in a particular mood to listen to, and I do think that Strange Free World and The Death of Cool are stronger, but regardless, this is still an amazing album, and it was so great to see them reunite after almost 20 years and deliver us such a great collection of tracks that give us a lot of new sounds that we hadn't heard on their previous releases, but also give us a few tracks that give us a throwback to that classic Kitchens of Distinction sound. So a very good return album. This one gets an A. All right, we did it. That covers their 5 studio albums, and these are the scores that I came up with. Really an amazing discography with so much great stuff in every album. This is a band that I would say does not have a bad album, and I haven't seen any news about them over the past few years, but I do remain hopeful that they might release another album sometime in the coming years. If they were able to write new stuff after an almost 20-year hiatus, I think it's entirely possible that they might surprise us with another album at some point, and I think think now would be a great time to do so because there's definitely been a resurgence in shoegaze over recent years, and we've seen multiple bands surprise us with return albums after long periods of no releases, with groups like Slowdive, Swervedriver, My Bloody Valentine, and Ride, among many others. So let's remain hopeful, but regardless if they ever end up making another album or not, they have certainly left their mark on the world of shoegaze, dream pop, and alternative rock, and they are a band that deserves much wider recognition for the amazing and unique music that they have created. So that is it for today. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you enjoyed it, and hopefully you learned a thing or two about this band. And if you are interested, please feel free to check out my other tier lists. They will be linked in the description and in the comments as well. Check it out, see if there's anything else that you might like. Alright, that's it for today. Thanks again for listening, and I will see you at the next video. Take care.